Can you remember any specific ones or specific, instances where a story was being covered and it was talked about, here's a delicate matter and this is why it's a delicate matter?
Early on, it was June 1973, and I was then working out of the Tel Aviv bureau of the Reuters news agency. And the chancellor of West Germany, Willy Brandt, was making the first visit to Israel by a German leader since the Holocaust, since the end of World War II. So it was a huge story. Willy Brandt comes to Israel, first German chancellor to visit the Jewish state after World War II. I was the low man in the Tel Aviv bureau, the low person. So he was going to be there for almost a week, and everybody was divided who would cover his address before the Knesset, Israel's parliament, who would cover his meetings with Golda Meir, the prime minister, who would cover all sorts of other things. And he was going to go visit Masada, this mountaintop Roman fortress from 2,000 years in the desert. A lot of German young college students had come in the 60s and 70s on archaeological digs. And he was going to go visit Masada. And so Jewish zealots 2,000 years ago, instead of giving up to the Romans, they committed suicide, basically, fought and died. And it's a very historic event. So Reuters said, you go and cover this. So I remember driving down from Tel Aviv. We got there very early. It was June, so it was already hot. And he was going to be landing, I think, at the top of Masada around 8 o'clock in the morning. So I was there by 6. We made our way to the top on these cable cars. And as he was coming down on his helicopter to land on a flat area, a gust of wind, all of a sudden out of the blue, and this happens in the desert sometimes, appeared out of nowhere and began lifting and jolting his helicopter. It was an Israeli military helicopter. And as it was maybe 20 feet off the ground, you could see it was not in a good position. There were about 70 or 80 journalists who were there covering it, and we were behind a little barrier. But here I was, a young kid, and I'm saying to myself, oh my God, the Chancellor of Germany, the Foreign Minister of Germany, the Israeli leadership, they're in this helicopter, and it looks like it touches down, and the wind begins to push it, and it's about to go over the precipice, over the side, and then there's like a 2,000-foot drop to the bottom of this mountain. And I said to myself, wow. Miraculously, amazingly, there was this 3-foot wall at the bottom, right at the edge, and the wheels of the helicopter caught that wall, and the helicopter stopped and didn't go over. Even when the wheels caught it, we thought the wind was still going to blow it over, and all these people would die. It stopped. The next thing I knew, Yigal Yadin, who was Israel's foremost archaeologist at the time, forever, former chief of staff of the Israeli army, deputy prime minister, he pushes Willy Brandt out of the helicopter. The foreign minister of Germany, the other, and they all get out. And they were okay. I think the foreign minister broke his arm. Chancellor Willy Brandt was okay. He was shaken but not hurt. So the Yigal Yadin, to his credit, sees what's happening, sees the media is there. We're on top of this mountain, and he immediately says, "Are you okay?" And Chancellor Brandt says, "I'm okay." The foreign minister was not okay, so they took him aside. And he says, "Let's go on the tour. Are you ready to continue this tour?" And Willy Brandt said, "Yes." And so they began the tour, and he said, "Well, here are German archaeology students." I had a dilemma. I said, what do I do? Here I am at the top of this mountain. Do I continue for what was supposed to be about an hour and a half tour, or do I try to break the story of what happened? Now, there were no cell phones in those days. One of the things that Reuters had taught me early on, when you see breaking news in those days, you got to find a telephone, and you got to call somebody and start dictating a story. That was the only way to do it. There's no internet, nothing like that. When I got there at 6 o'clock in the morning, at the bottom of Masada, there was a little coffee shop or a little tourist shop, and I remember that there was a payphone. And one of my mentors at Reuters always said, look for a payphone and make sure you have a lot of coins, because you never know when you're going to have to make a call. So In Israel, the payphones were, I don't know about now, but in those days they had tokens that you'd put in, and they'd last for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, and then they'd swallow it up, and then you'd have to put more in. So you could put a bunch in. And I only had maybe 5 or 10 tokens, not many. But I figured if there was an emergency, it never dawned on me. Everybody thought this was just going to be a little sightseeing, color story, German Chancellor visits Masada. We didn't know that he was almost going to die. So I had to make a decision, do I stay on the tour, or do I get to that one phone and start and break the news? And I said to myself, I work for a wire service, 24 hours a day. It's now 8 o'clock in the morning, people are interested. So I left. I saw what was going on. I ran to the trolley car, and the Israeli soldier, said, nobody's allowed to go down. And I started screaming at him. I said, please, you got to let me go down. I work for a wire service. I saw AP was there. I saw UPI was there. And I didn't know what they were going to do, but I had to get down there. And finally, I talked him into taking me down. I get to this one payphone, and I put my tokens in, and I call the Tel Aviv bureau of Reuters, and Colin Bickler, who was then one of the senior guys, he's on the other line. He's originally from New Zealand. He had just come to Israel from Vietnam, because the Vietnam War was winding down, the Middle East was winding up. And he said, and I said, Colin, I only have a few of these tokens. Here's my number at this payphone. Call me right back, please. And it was a bad connection. And he said, what's going on? I said, just take this number down. I got a big story. Call me right back. And then he said, well, what is happening? And I said, write down the number. And I used some bad words. And I said, just write down the number. And I gave him the number. And by the last number, I wasn't sure he had heard it. I didn't know if the connection got through. It was really scratchy. And I hang up the phone. I got no more tokens. And I'm waiting for whatever seemed forever. And finally, after a few minutes, he connected with me. The phone rings, and now it's on his dime, so he can talk as long as he wants. So he said, what's going on? I told him what was going on. He said, all right. They did a bulletin, news alert, whatever they called it, and it was called a bulletin in those days. A helicopter carrying West German Chancellor Willy Brandt nearly blew off the top of Masada. The Chancellor was shaken but unhurt. That was like the news alert. And we filed it. It caused a big stir, especially in Germany, in Europe, in the United States. It was a big story. So then the journalistic dilemma, the ethical question came up, because I started giving them color, and I started giving more details, and we started moving more paragraphs on the wire, which was our job. The other journalists start coming running down from the trolley car from the top. There's one phone there. That's it. Now, Colin Bickler said to me, if you hang up the phone, I don't want you to hang up the phone until his helicopter has gone, he's back out of there, and he's gone. You're going to be under enormous pressure, because everybody's AP, UPI, New York Times, and all the German media, they're all going to want to use this phone. You're going to be fired if you get off the phone. We're staying on this phone until that helicopter is safely out of the way. So, I did it. I stayed on the phone. I had all these other journalists who wanted to kill me, basically, because they wanted to. But that was one of the initial ethical dilemmas I faced early on. Was it the right thing? Did I do the right thing in refusing to give up that one line, or should I have shared it with the competition? I think I did the right thing. It's a competitive world out there. We were reporting the news. If that helicopter, upon taking off the second time, would have crashed, and helicopters are not smooth all the time, we wouldn't have had any way of communicating that. There's no live Israel television, Israel radio. Nobody was broadcasting this live or anything. So I learned at that time that it's a competitive business, the news business. I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't lie to anybody. I didn't steal anything. I was the one who got to that phone first, and I just didn't give it up until the story was over, basically. So that was an early ethical decision.
It's a good story. Can you remember other things along those lines?
Look, over the years, there have been a lot of questions about journalistic ethics that I've had to deal with. I'll give you another example of an ethical problem that we had. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, August 1st, 1990. I'm CNN's Pentagon correspondent. That day, we had known that the Iraqis were moving troops from the Iranian border to the Kuwaiti border. For a week, they had been building up their presence north of Kuwait. First 25,000, 50,000, 100,000 Iraqi troops, including their so-called elite Republican Guard, were now on the border with Kuwait in the days leading up to the invasion. And U.S. intelligence was monitoring it. They were watching what was going on. And I was the Pentagon correspondent. That day, I remember having lunch with the chief of naval operations, who was new in the job, and I asked him, I said, what's with the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein? They're massing troops. And he said, well, our intelligence estimate is that he's threatening the Emir of Kuwait, wants to raise the price of oil, because they need the money. But our intelligence estimate of the US government is he's not going to invade a fellow Arab country. There might be some tension along the border, some border skirmishes, but it's just designed to exert pressure on the Emir of Kuwait. That night, I was having dinner. A few journalists were invited to a dinner with a high-ranking CIA official, one of these off-the-record kind of dinners. And I asked him the same question. I said, what's going on with the Iraqis on the border? And he basically said the same thing the chief of naval operations said. He said, you know, I think he's trying to intimidate the Emir, raise the price of oil. We don't think he's going to invade a fellow Arab country. That's the estimate of the US government. Fine. I'm driving home. It's about 10 o'clock at night now, 10:15. And as I'm pulling in my driveway, my beeper, those days you had beepers, goes off and it vibrates. And I look down, it's my news desk. And I go into my study, my house. And the news editor says, Wolf, Reuters is quoting sources in the Persian Gulf as saying Iraqi troops have crossed the border and have gone into Kuwait. Obviously, we don't have this. Can you check it out? And I said, hey, I just had dinner with a high-ranking CIA official. I had lunch with the chief of naval operations. There may be some border skirmishes, but they're not going to invade a fellow Arab country, and just blah, blah, blah. I gave him the whole US government estimate. Fortunately, my editor said, look, do me a favor, check it out, see what you can find out. It's a big story. I said, okay, so what does a journalist do in Washington to check out a story like this, which could be a huge story, or it could be just, nothing? I said to myself, if it were true, I work in reverse. Let's assume it's true. I said, if it's true, then I have a good source in DIA at the Pentagon who's in charge of the Persian Gulf. He's not at home getting ready to go to sleep. It's now 10:30 at night or whatever. He's been called back to the emergency room, the tank, whatever they call it there. There's a crisis at the Pentagon. He'd be at his desk, at his office. I'll call, and so I said, you know what? I'll just call his direct number at his office, see if it just rings, or if there's a pickup. And I was sure that it would just ring, but I said, oh, I got to try. It's my job. So I called that direct number, and to my utter amazement, on the first ring, I hear a very agitated, yeah. And I knew it was him. And I said, you're working? And he said, yeah. I said, Reuters is quoting sources in the Gulf as saying the Iraqis have crossed the line and gone into Kuwait. What can you tell me? And he hesitated for a while. There was a pregnant pause. But after 15, 20 seconds or whatever, he said, and I'll never forget it because I wrote it down in my notebook. He said, Wolf, it's a lot worse than that. I said, what's going on? He said, not only have they crossed the line and gone into Kuwait, they are moving through Kuwait like a knife goes through butter. This is a full-scale invasion. The Emir of Kuwait has already fled. Their tiny air force has flown into Saudi Arabia. This is a disaster. Cheney is the defense secretary. He's in the National Military Command Center. Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They've all been alerted. I said, what time was it into this breaking? And he said, about 8 o'clock, our time. And I said, wow. So this was a reliable source, someone I've worked with over the years, someone I knew well. I knew he was working. I felt confident calling back CNN and saying, this is what we can report. A source at the Pentagon tells CNN X, Y, and Z. I do that. I do it on the phone. We do breaking news. The whole world is watching, obviously, by then. CNN's not only in the United States, but it's live around the world. The bureau chief, Bill Headline, that's his real name, calls me up a few seconds after I hang up the phone, says, Wolf, I know you've been working all day. Take a shower, put on a clean shirt, get back to the Pentagon. You're going to be live all night. And of course I did that. So I'm walking into the Pentagon, and you see the parking lots filling up. They're coming in, all the workers. In those days, if the Russians wanted to know if there was a crisis, they could send their satellite over the parking lots at the Pentagon. If they see a lot of cars there, they know there's a crisis. So it's now midnight, I'm on the air, and I report what I knew. I didn't know a whole lot more. I had spoken to one or two more people, but I really didn't have much more information. And I remember the anchor saying to me in a follow-up question, so Wolf, what's the Bush administration going to do about this? This is the first President Bush. And I felt like saying, beats me, I have no clue. But you can't say that on television, so I said, well, in the week leading up, the officials were saying there's no treaty alliance with Kuwait, there's no formal recognition of any treaty pact or anything like that. The Kuwaitis, the Saudis, they never wanted to have US troops there. They wanted them to be over the horizon, Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean or someplace. So I said, there's probably not a whole lot the US can do right now. And that's what I said, something along those lines. And we had a little exchange like that. I come back to my office, and I got it, even before I could sit down, the phone is ringing. I pick up, and it's a high-ranking Pentagon official, very high-ranking. And he said, Wolf, we're watching you in the National Military Command Center. We just saw your report. And that didn't instill a whole lot of confidence in me that they were the National Military Command Center watching my report. I'm saying to myself, don't they have better things to do than watching my and he said, don't you know what you've just done? And I said, help me. He said, you have basically told Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi military leadership to not only go through all of Kuwait, but to continue moving towards the oil fields in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia and continue to take over the oil in Saudi Arabia, because there's not much that can stop them. Kuwaitis can't stop them, Saudis couldn't stop them, and the US, you basically just told them, really doesn't have any military capability in the region. And I said, so what are you going to do about all this? And he said, well, the president has authorized me to tell you that he is not ruling out any option, including the military option, in stopping the Iraqis and preventing and making sure that this does not survive or whatever. And I said, can I report that? I said, yes, you can report that. Now, it was clear to me that they wanted to send a message to Baghdad. And in the olden days, they would get through some Swiss embassy or send a diplomatic message with a démarche or whatever. They didn't have the time because they were moving. It was daylight, it was now morning in Kuwait, and the Iraqis were moving. And the fastest way they could send a message to the Iraqis was through me. This military guy had said to me, he said, Wolf, when you're standing at the Pentagon in the briefing room with the map of the world behind you, the American flag behind you, the podium seal of the Department of Defense behind you, and they're watching you in Baghdad as they were, they don't see you as CNN, Wolf Blitzer, private journalist. They think you are the Pentagon. They don't understand that you're just a reporter. They think you're the United States, and when you just say there's not a whole lot the U.S. can do, at least in the short term, to stop this, they're going to be encouraged. So the dilemma I faced, I said to myself, well, I know they're using me because they want to send a message. On the other hand, there's news. The President of the United States, I have just been told by a senior Pentagon official, is issuing a warning that all options are on the table, including the military option in stopping the Iraqis. Now, if the President of the United States conveys that message through an official of the Pentagon to me, do I report it or do I not report it? My attitude was, I report it. It's news. Am I at the same time being used, quote, or to send a message? Of course, I understood that. But I understood also that I had to get the news out. And obviously we know what happened in Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm in the 6, 7, 8 months that followed. But it was an initial ethical dilemma that I felt that I had, that I think I made the right call on that one. And I'll give you one more ethical issue that came up later in January of 1991, if you're interested. Are you interested?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. The war starts, the air war starts, and the U.S. is pounding Baghdad. In retaliation, Saddam Hussein starts launching Scud missiles into Saudi Arabia and into Israel. And some of the first Scud missiles that he launched landed in Israel. And I remember the first one that landed in Israel. The Israelis announced, and the U.S. announced, the Iraqis announced, the Scud missile was fired, landed in Israel. Now, I had worked at Israel for the Reuters news agency. I knew Israel. I was curious. Where did that Scud missile hit? What kind of damage did it cause? So I call up my sources at the Pentagon, and they tell me the Scud missile lands in Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, not far from the Diamond Exchange, the Diamond Mart. I knew exactly where it was. It hit a building, but it didn't cause any loss of life. A couple people were injured, nobody dead, caused some damage to the building. And I report, I go on the air, and I say that initial Scud that lands in Israel landed in the suburb of Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, near the Diamond Exchange. Which I thought, I come back to my desk, I get another angry phone call from a senior Pentagon official saying, Wolf, what are you doing? And I said, help me. I don't know. I must be doing something wrong. He said, why are you becoming a spotter for the Iraqi military? I said, what? He said, why are you telling them where their Scud missile lands? Don't you realize that if they adjust it, they were aiming for the Israeli Defense Ministry, which was about a mile away from that spot. And if you're telling them that they have to adjust their calculation a little bit and they'll hit the Israeli Defense Ministry, which is what they were trying to do. And you basically just told them how to do it. And I said, well, I didn't realize that. So I faced an ethical dilemma. Do I suppress this from now on? Specific details, where the missile lands? I consulted with our CNN executives, our news executives, and we all made a decision, and then all the major news organizations agreed with us, that from then on, whether in Saudi Arabia or in Israel or anyplace else, we wouldn't say where the missiles landed. We would just give a generic, they landed in central Israel. Wouldn't say what cities or anything, or they landed in central or eastern Saudi Arabia. We wouldn't say Riyadh or Tehran or anything like that. We would just, because we didn't want to start becoming spotters for the Iraqi military. So we suppressed that news. Now, was that a journalistically ethical decision? In my opinion, it was, because as much as we're news people, we're also human beings, and we don't want to do anything that's going to allow people to die, whether U.S. soldiers in Saudi Arabia or Israelis, or, we're not going to do anything like that. So we made that call that we were going to suppress and not give the specific location of where these Scuds, and he launched a lot of Scuds. We knew where they were landing, but we never, after that first burst by me, nobody else ever reported that. Again, we would just say generically where they landed.
Did you explain to viewers
Yes, we did.
that you knew that, but you were suppressing?
I was totally transparent with the viewers, and I would say, we know where these missiles are landing, but we're not going to tell you, and here's why. And my belief over all of these 35 years, or almost 40 years of being a journalist, has always been, if you're transparent with the viewers or the readers or the listeners, you're honest with them, you tell them why you're making these decisions, they'll accept that. It's only when you try to conceal something and mislead or whatever, then you get into journalistic ethical trouble. But if you're honest with them, they'll appreciate it. Now, over the years, there have not been many cases where we've suppressed information for national security considerations. There have been times, and it's got to be a great case that the government makes when we do that. And it almost always has to be lives are at stake.
There must be. I also wanted to go back to the run-up to the Iraq War, and when people look back now, and I know both the New York Times and the Washington Post printed these sort of mea culpas that we were too credulous, we focused sort of over much on the administration's case for the war, and not enough on the skeptics who were saying, well, wait a minute, he doesn't really have the weapons of mass destruction. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence of any kind of cahoots between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. When you look back on that coverage now, I mean, how do you evaluate it?
I think we could have done a better job. It's hard. You know, we did have skeptics on. On my shows, I had Dr. Hans Blitz, who was the UN weapons inspector. I had Dr. Mohammed al-Baradei, the nuclear, the IAEA Secretary General. I had skeptics who were on saying, well, it's not true. And even some members of Congress, Senator Bob Graham of Florida was a skeptic, and I had him on often. On the other hand, when the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Head of the Intelligence, CIA, they're all telling Congress and the American public and the United Nations, here is the evidence of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. You got to report that. I mean, if the CIA director says that, if Colin Powell, that was the Secretary of State, goes before the United Nations Security Council with his pictures and diagrams, and you got to report that. Should we have been more skeptical in our reporting? Probably. Certainly now that we know that there were no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, and there was not much of a nuclear program, if at all, no biological or chemical weapons. They had a capability to develop them, but they didn't have any. And Saddam Hussein wanted us to believe that he had it, so to intimidate his enemies and to try to deter the U.S. and the others from invading them, so that he didn't deny it. But certainly, look, journalism is the first draft of history, and we do our best. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. Can we always do a better job? Yes. Could we have done a better job then? I'm sure we could have. It wasn't as if we totally ignored the other side. And remember, we were also getting confirmation from all of the other allies that Saddam Hussein had this. The British and the French, they were all agreeing with the US. And even some of the Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, they didn't, they weren't disputing. So you did have the French who were saying, he may have it, but there are other ways of dealing with it other than going to war. You don't necessarily have to go to war. You can put them in a box and contain them, and sanctions and diplomatic pressure, stuff like that. So there was a dispute about whether or not the invasion was necessary. And we reported all of that. Scholars like you will continue to study that and see if we could have done a better job.